Got it?
Yep.
All right. Demands. On May 30th, 2020, a protest was organized by community activists in Rockford, Illinois, to march in solidarity with the city of Minneapolis after the murder of George Floyd by police officer Derek Chauvin, and to bring awareness to the countless victims of police terrorism in the city of Rockford. During the protest, speeches were given by members of the community, and a march was held that ended at Rockford Police District 1. At District 1, after speeches, a handful of people at the protest began throwing rocks and other objects at the District 1 building, but after discourse between community members, items ceased being thrown and no one was injured. The officers of District 1 stayed inside of the building throughout the entirety of this happening. However, shortly after this, the district commander, Ken Weisenhan, led officers out of the building in riot gear. Before any order of dispersal was given, officers of the Rockford Police Department began assaulting people in attendance of the protest using cruel and unusual forms of brutality and violence. Pepper spray bullets, stomping, kicking, punching, tasing, slamming, and knees on necks were all used in efforts to terrorize children, teenagers, young adults, and the elderly. 10 people were falsely arrested and over 100 citizens were physically and physiologically damaged by the actions of local law enforcement. These are the demands of the victims of the police brutality attack of May 30th in Rockford, Illinois. Demands from the victims of the May 30th police brutality attack. Number 1. We demand all charges in connection to the protest on May 30th be dropped immediately without contingency on any agreement or deal being signed by the wrongfully accused parties. Number 2, we demand the City of Rockford procure an entity outside of the Rockford Police Department to investigate the actions taken by officers on May 30th due to the conflict of interest. Number 3, we demand the inherent biased findings of the Rockford Police Department investigation and the findings of the investigation done by an outside source be released in full without redaction to the public. Number 4, we demand to be informed of the badge number and name of each officer at the precinct on May 30th, informed of each officer who made an arrest, and to be informed of each officer who discharged their taser. Number 5, we demand all elected officials in the city of Rockford condemn the actions taken by the Rockford Police Department on May 30th and also condemn the lack of results the investigation into the conduct of RPD on May 30th has yielded. Number 6, we demand the city of Rockford make accommodations and pay in full for the services of counselors, therapists, or psychiatrists or anything else needed to help the mental health of those traumatized by the actions of their officers. The city should make accommodations for up to 12 months to pay these services for each individual. We demand that all officers that participated in the violation of the human rights of the protesters on May 30th be terminated immediately and their crimes against humanity be punished to the fullest extent of the law. During the summer of 2020, weekly protests were hosted at City Market to raise awareness to the victims of the police brutality attack of May 30th in the city of Rockford, Illinois. For the first 5 weeks, these protests occurred with demonstrators assuming the role of pedestrians, walking continuously on the crosswalk on East State Street and Water Street, horizontal to City Market. Megaphones were used to project the voices of activists speaking about May 30th, and siren functions of those megaphones were used to alert traffic of the ongoing demonstration, a safety precaution. All of these things occurred with no arrests and no laws broken. The Rockford Police Department even went as far as to set up roadblocks using police vehicles on multiple weeks. On July 31st, in concert with the Winnebago County Sheriff's Department, the Rockford Police Department assaulted multiple demonstrators on the crosswalk of East State and Water Street in the process of arresting 14 people. For the next 8 weeks, the Winnebago County Sheriff's Department and the Rockford Police Department, along with the City of Rockford and the County of Winnebago, conspired to use terroristic tactics to intimidate citizens who participated in the protest at City Market. People were assaulted in a myriad of ways, including being pepper sprayed and slammed to the ground, in the process of 33 people in total being falsely arrested and jailed by law enforcement. The demands from #CityMarket2020. Number 1, we demand all charges in connection to the City Market protest be dropped immediately without contingency on any deal or agreement by the wrongfully accused parties. Number 2, we demand an investigation into the violation of human rights in connection with the City Market protests by the Rockford Police Department, Winnebago County Sheriff's Office, Rockford Park District, Metro Enforcement Agency, and any other agencies involved. Number 3, we demand all elected officials in the city of Rockford and in Winnebago County to make a public statement about the violation of human rights of protesters by the Rockford Police Department, Winnebago County Sheriff's Office, Rockford Park District, and Metro Enforcement Agency in connection to the City Market protest. Number 4, we demand the City of Rockford and Winnebago County make accommodations and pay in full for the services of counselors, therapists, or psychiatrists, or anything else needed to help the mental health of those traumatized by the actions of their officers in connection to the City Market protest. The city should make accommodations for up to 12 months to pay for these services to each individual. Number 5, we demand that the Winnebago County Sheriff's Office return all personal property, including but not limited to cell phones, speakers, and 20 megaphones to the people who were arrested at the City Market protest. Number 6, we demand City of Rockford and Winnebago County ban the use of chemical agents by Rockford Police Department, Winnebago County Sheriff's Office, and Metro Enforcement Agency at areas the city and county designates as protest zones. Number 7, we demand Sergeant Tom Brimhall's son, Adam Pickett, be charged for assault and unlawful restraint for the actions he took on a protester July 31st at the City Market protest. Number 8, we demand that Kathy McDermott be terminated from her position at Rockford City Market and be replaced with someone who puts the community's interest above economic gain. Number 9, we demand Peter Provenzano and Rock River Development Partnership give ownership, all rights, and control of Rockford City Market to the City of Rockford so that it can be handled in a more equitable and democratic manner. Number 10, we demand that all officers that participated in the violation of the human rights of the protesters in connection to the City Market protest be terminated immediately and their crimes against humanity punished to the fullest extent of the law. On October 3, 2020, a protest began in the form of an occupation outside of Rockford City Hall after Tyrese Jones, an unarmed black man, was shot in the back by Rockford Police Department officer Dominic McNeese on October 2, 2020, in Rockford, Illinois. The demands of the protesters organizing the demonstration were as reads. Number 1, a press conference from Rockford Mayor Tom McNamara. Number 2, in said press conference, Tom McNamara spoke on the shooting of Tyrese Jones and the ongoing police terrorism that took place in the spring and summer in Rockford, Illinois. Number 3, Mayor Tom McNamara answered questions from the media at said press conference. The mayor instead released a Facebook post 2 days after the shooting in which he never even stated the name of the victim he was referring to in his statement. On October 5th, 2 of the protesters participating in the occupation were assaulted at the hands of Rockford Police Department in the process of 6 people ultimately being arrested. Since the demands the protesters put forward were never met in full, the occupation continued through this attack, and for the next 6 months, protesters continually occupied the outside of City Hall in Rockford, Illinois. While doing so, police officers have harassed, followed, and threatened citizens. They have torn down structures being used to house people in deadly cold weather. They have stolen blankets, hand warmers, food, and clothes from protesters in the middle of the night. The city officials of Rockford who work inside of City Hall have engaged in racist microaggressions throughout the entirety of the occupation, primarily executed in the form of white people weaponizing the police on people of color. Demands from the victims of Occupy City Hall. Number 1, we demand all charges in connection to the occupation at City Hall be dropped immediately without a contingency on any deal or agreement by the wrongfully accused parties. Number 2, we demand all ordinance violations, fines, and parking tickets issued by the City of Rockford in connection with the occupation at City Hall be dropped immediately without contingency on any deal or agreement by the wrongfully accused parties. Number 3, we demand the City of Rockford, the Winnebago County State's Attorney, and the Rockford Police Department to release all video footage of arrests made in connection with the occupation at City Hall. Number 4, we demand the resignation of Assistant Deputy Chief Carla Red and Rockford Police Department Officer Brandon Mather for their assaults during arrests on individuals at occupation at City Hall. Number 6, we demand Tom McNamara hold a press conference open to the public addressing past cases of shootings by the police and the ongoing police terrorism in Rockford. Number 7, we demand the City of Rockford make accommodations and pay in full for the services of counselors, therapists, or psychiatrists, or anything else needed to help the mental health of those traumatized by the actions of their officers and employees in connection to the occupation at City Hall. The city should make accommodations for up to 12 months to pay these services to each individual. Number 8, we demand that the City of Rockford and the Rockford Police Department return all property taken from the occupation, including but not limited to canopies, cell phone, blankets, chairs, and megaphones to the occupation at City Hall. Number 9, we demand Kyle Saunders be terminated from his position immediately and be replaced with an individual that puts the community's needs over the government's interest. Number 10, we demand all bans from City Hall property be lifted immediately without contingency on any deal or agreement by those involved in the occupation at City Hall. Okay, and then now we are going to go ahead and get started with our reading of Caste, The Origins of Our Discontents by Isabel Wilkerson. Get to the beginning of it here. There's a couple quotes here. One's from James Baldwin that says, "Because even if I should speak, no one would believe me, and they would not believe me precisely because they would know that what I said was true." And by Albert Einstein, "If the majority knew of the root of this evil, then the road to its cure would not be long." Okay. I'm going to start with the man in the crowd. Sorry about that. Okay. There is a famous black and white photograph from the era of the Third Reich. It is a picture taken in Hamburg, Germany, in 1936 of shipyard workers, 100 or more, facing the same direction in the light of the sun. They are hailing in unison, their right arms rigid in outstretched allegiance to the Führer. If you look closely, you can see a man in the upper right who is different from the others. His face is gentle but unyielding. Modern-day displays of the photograph will often add a helpful red circle around the man or an arrow pointing to him. He is surrounded by fellow citizens caught under the spell of the Nazis. He keeps his arm folded to his chest as the stiff palms of the others hover just inches from him. He alone is refusing to salute. He is the one man standing against the tide. Looking back from our vantage point, he's the only person in the entire scene who's on the right side of history. Everyone around him is tragically, fatefully, categorically wrong. In that moment, only he could see it. His name is believed to have been August Landmesser. At the time, he could not have known the murderous path the hysteria around him would lead to, but he had already seen enough to reject it. He had joined the Nazi Party himself years before. By now, though, he knew firsthand that the Nazis were feeding Germans lies about Jews, the outcasts of the era, that even this early in the Reich, the Nazis had caused terror, heartache, and disruption. He knew that Jews were anything but Untermenschen, that they were German citizens, human as anyone else. He was an Aryan in love with a Jewish woman, but the recently enacted Nuremberg laws had made their relationship illegal. They were forbidden to marry or have sexual relations, either of which amounted to what the Nazis called racial infamy. His personal experience and close connection to the scapegoated caste allowed him to see past the lives. Let me start that one over. His personal experience and close connection to the scapegoated caste allowed him to see past the lies and stereotypes so readily embraced by susceptible members, the majority, sadly, of the dominant caste. Though Aryan himself, his openness to the humanity of the people who had deemed beneath him, Though Aryan himself, his openness to the humanity of the people who had been deemed beneath him gave a stake in their well-being, their fates tied to his. He could see what his countrymen chose not to see. In a totalitarian regime such as that of the Third Reich, it was an act of bravery to stand firm against a notion. Excuse me. We would all want to believe that we would have been him. We might feel certain that, were we Aryan citizens under the Third Reich, we surely would have seen through it, would have risen above it like him, been that person resisting authoritarianism and brutality in the face of mass hysteria. We would like to believe that we would have taken the more difficult path of standing up against injustice in defense of the outcast. But unless people are willing to transcend their fears, endure discomfort and derision, suffer the scorn of loved ones and neighbors and co-workers and friends, fall into disfavor of perhaps everyone they know, face exclusion and even banishment, it would be numerically impossible, humanly impossible, for everyone to be that man. What would it take to be him in any era? What would it take to be him now? Part 1. Toxins in the permafrost and heat rising all around. Chapter 1. The Afterlife of Pathogens. In the haunted summer of 2016, an unaccustomed heat wave struck the Siberian tundra on the edge of what the ancients once called end of the land. Above the Arctic Circle and far from the tectonic plates colliding in American politics, the heat rose beneath the Earth's surface and also bore down from above, the air reaching an inconceivable 95 degrees on the Russian peninsula of Yamal. Wildfires flared, and pockets of methane gurgled beneath the normally frozen soil in the polar region. Soon the children of the indigenous herdsmen fell sick from a mysterious illness that many people alive have never seen and did not recognize. A 12-year-old boy developed high fever and acute stomach pangs and passed away. Russian authorities declared a state of emergency and began airlifting hundreds of the sick and hurting people, the Nanettes, to the nearest hospital in Salikard. Scientists then identified what had afflicted the Siberian settlements. The apparent heat had chiseled far deep into the Russian permafrost than was normal and had exposed a toxin that had been encased since 1941, when the world was last at war. It was the pathogen anthrax, which had killed herds of reindeer all those decades ago and lain hidden in the animal carcass long since buried in the permafrost. A thawed and tainted carcass rose to the surface that summer. The pathogen awakened, intact and as powerful as it had ever been. The pathogen spores seeped into the grazing land and infected the reindeer and spread to the herders who raised and relied upon them. The anthrax, like the reactivism of the human pathogens of hatred and tribalism in this evolving century, had never died. It lay in wait, sleeping, until extreme circumstances brought it to the surface and back to life. On the other side of the planet, the world's oldest and most powerful democracy was in spasms over an election that would transfix the Western world and become a psychic break in American history, one that will likely be studied and dissected for generations. That summer and into the fall and in the ensuing years to come, amid talk of Muslim bans, nasty women, border walls, and shithole nations, it was common to hear in certain circles the disbelieving cries of, "This is not America," or "I don't recognize my country," or "This is not who we are," except that was and is our country, and this was and is who we are, whether we have known or recognized it or not. The heat rose in the Arctic and in random encounters in America. That late summer in New York City, in Indigo Harbor, in a safely blue state, a white man in Brooklyn, an artist, was helping a middle-aged white woman carry her groceries to a southbound subway in the direction of Coney Island. By then it was impossible to avoid talk of the campaign. It had been a political season unlike any other. For the first time in history, a woman was running as a major party candidate for President of the United States. A household name, the candidate was a no-nonsense national figure, overqualified by some estimates, conventional and measured, if uninspiring to her detractors, with a firm grasp of any policy or crises that she might be called upon to address. Her opponent was an impetuous billionaire, a reality television star prone to insulting most anyone unlike himself, who had never held public office and whose pundits believed had no chance of winning his party's primaries, much less the presidency. Before the campaign was over, the male candidate would stalk the female candidate from behind during a debate seen all over the world. He would boast of grabbing women by their genitals, mock the disabled, encourage violence against the press and against those who disagreed with him. His followers jeered the female candidate, chanting "Lock her up," at mass rallies all over which the billionaire presided. His comments and activities were deemed so coarse that some news reports were preceded by parental advisories. Here was a candidate so transparently unqualified for the job, wrote The Guardian in 2016, that his candidacy seemed more like a prank than a serious bid for the White House. On the face of it, which is what is commonly termed race in America, was not an issue. Both candidates were white, born to the country's historic dominant majority. But the woman candidate represented the more liberal party, made up of a patchwork of coalitions of, roughly speaking, the humanitarian-minded and the marginalized. The male candidate represented the conservative party that in recent decades had come to be seen as protecting an old social order, benefiting and appealing largely to white voters. The candidates were polar opposites, equally loathed by the fans of their respective adversary. The extremes of that season forced Americans to take sides and declare their allegiances or find a way to dance around them. So on an otherwise ordinary day, as the Brooklyn artist was helping the older woman with her groceries, she turned to him, unbidden, and wanted to know who he was voting for. The artist, being a progressive, said he was planning to vote for the Democrat, the more experienced candidate. The older woman with the groceries must have suspected as much and was displeased with his answer. She, like millions of other Americans in the historic majority, had brightened to the blunt-spoken appeals of the nativist billionaire. Only weeks before, the billionaire had said that he could shoot someone on Fifth Avenue and his followers would still vote for him, devoted as they were. The woman overladen with groceries was one of them. In the bluest of sanctuaries, she had heard his call and decoded his messages. She took it upon herself to instruct the artist on the error of his thinking and why it was urgent that he vote the right way. "Yes, I know he mouths off at times," she conceded, drawing closer to her potential convert, "but he will restore our sovereignty." It was then, before the debates and cascading revelations to come, that the Brooklyn man realized that despite the odds and all historic precedent, a reality star with the least formal experience of perhaps anyone who had ever run for president could become the leader of the free world. The campaign had become more than a political rivalry. It was an existential plight for primacy in a country whose demographics had been shifting beneath us all. People who looked like the Brooklyn artist and the woman headed toward Coney Island, those whose ancestry traced back to Europe, had been in the historic ruling majority. The dominant racial caste in an unspoken hierarchy since before the founding of the Republic. But in the years leading to this moment, it had begun to spread on talk radio and cable television that the white share of the population was shrinking. In the summer of 2008, the U.S. Census Bureau announced its projection that by 2042, for the first time in American history, whites would no longer be the majority in a country that had been known of no other configuration, no other way to be. Then, that fall, in the midst of what seemed a cataclysmic financial crisis, and as if to announce a potential slide from preeminence for the caste that had long been dominant, an African American, a man from what was historically the lowest caste, was elected President of the United States. His ascension incited both premature declarations of post-racial world and an entire movement whose sole purpose was to prove that he had not been born in the United States. A campaign led by the billionaire who was now, in 2016, running for president himself. A low rumble had been churning beneath the surface, neurons excited by the prospect of a cocksure champion for the dominant caste, a mouthpiece for their anxieties. Some people grew bolder because of it. A police commander in southern New Jersey talked about mowing down African Americans and complained that the woman candidate, the Democrat, would give in to all the minorities. That September, he beat a handcuffed black teenager who had been arrested for swimming in a pool without authorization. The commander grabbed the teenager's head and, witnesses said, rammed it like a basketball into a metal door jamb. As the election drew near, the commander told his officers that the reality television star is the last hope for white people. Observers the world over recognized the significance of the election. Onlookers in Berlin and Johannesburg, Delhi and Moscow, Beijing and Tokyo stayed up late into the night or the next morning to watch the returns that first Tuesday in November 2016. Inexplicably, to many outside the United States, the outcome would turn not on the popular vote, but on the Electoral College, an American invention from the founding era of slavery by which each state has a say in declaring the winner based on the electoral votes assigned them on the outcome of the popular ballot in their jurisdiction. By then, there had been only 5 elections in the country's history in which the Electoral College or a similar mechanism had overruled the popular vote, 2 such cases occurring in the 21st century alone. One of those 2 was the election of 2016, a collision of unusual circumstance. The election would set the United States on a course toward isolationism, tribalism, the walling in and protecting of one's own, the worship of wealth and acquisition at the expense of others, even of the planet itself. After the votes had been counted and the billionaire declared the winner, to the shock of the world and of those perhaps less steeped in the country's racial and political history, a man on a golf course in Georgia could feel freer to express himself. He was the son of the Confederacy, which had gone to war against the United States for the rights to enslave other humans. The election was a victory for him and for the social order he had been born to. He said to those around him, "I remember a time when everybody knew their place. Time we got back to that." Oof. The sentiment of returning to an old order of things The closed hierarchy of the ancestors soon spread across the land in a headline-grabbing wave of hate crime and mass violence. Shortly after Inauguration Day, a white man in Kansas shot and killed an Indian engineer, telling the immigrant and his Indian co-worker to get out of my country, or he fired upon them. The next month, a clean-cut white Army veteran caught a bus from Baltimore to New York on a mission to kill black people. He stalked a 66-year-old black man in Times Square and stabbed him to death with a sword. The attacker would become the first white supremacist convicted on terrorism charges in the state of New York. On a packed commuter train in Portland, Oregon, a white man hurling racial and anti-Muslim epithets attacked two teenage girls, one of whom had been wearing a hijab. "Get the fuck out," he ranted. We need Americans here." When three white men rose to the girls' defense, the attacker stabbed the men for doing so. "I'm a patriot," the attacker told the police en route to jail, "and I hope everyone I stabbed died." Tragically, two of the men did not survive their wounds. Then in the summer of 2017, a white supremacist drove into a crowd of anti-hate protesters in Charlottesville, Virginia, killing a young white woman, Heather Heyer, in a standoff over monuments to the Confederacy that drew the eyes of the world. The year 2017 would become the deadliest to date for mass shootings in modern American history. In Las Vegas, there occurred the country's largest such massacre, followed by one mass shooting after another in public schools, parking lots, city streets, and superstores across the nation. In the fall of 2018, 11 worshippers were slain at a Jewish synagogue in Pittsburgh in the worst anti-Semitic attack on U.S. soil. Outside Louisville, Kentucky, a man attempted a similar assault on a black church, yanking the locked doors to try to break in and shoot parishioners at their Bible study. Unable to pry the doors open, the man went to a nearby supermarket and killed the first black people he saw. A black woman in the parking lot headed in for groceries, and a black man buying poster board with his grandson. An armed bystander happened to see the shooter in the parking lot, which got the shooter's attention. "Don't shoot me," the shooter told the onlooker, "and I won't shoot you." According to news reports, whites don't kill whites. In the ensuing months, as the new president pulled out of treaties and entreated dictators, many observers despaired of the end of democracy and feared for the republic. On his own, the new leader withdrew the world's oldest democracy from the 2016 Paris Agreement, in which the nations of the world had come together to battle climate change, leaving many to anguish over an already losing race to protect the planet. Soon a group of leading psychiatrists whose profession permits them to speak of their diagnosis only in the event of a person's danger to oneself or to others took the extraordinary step of forewarning the American public that the newly installed leader of the free world was a malignant narcissist, a danger to the public. By the second year of the administration, brown children were behind bars at the southern border, separated from their parents as they sought asylum. The decades-old protections of air and water and endangered species were summarily rolled back. Multiple campaign advisors faced prison terms in widening investigations into corruption, and a sitting president was being described as an agent of a foreign power. The opposition party had lost all three branches of government and fretted over what to do. It managed to win back the House of Representatives in 2018, but this left the party with only 1/6 of the government, meaning 1/2 of the legislative branch, and thus hesitant at first to begin impeachment proceedings that were its purview. Many feared a backlash, feared riling up the billionaire's base, in part because, though it represented a minority of the electorate, his base was made up overwhelmingly of people in the dominant caste. The single-mindedness of the president's followers and the anguish of the opposition seemed to compromise a system of checks and balances thought to be built into the foundation, and meant that for a time the United States was not, in the words of a Democratic Party chair in South Carolina, a fully functional democracy. At the start of the third year, the president was impeached by opponents in the lower chamber and acquitted by loyalists in the Senate, their votes falling along party lines that reflected the features of the country as a whole, fractures of the country as a whole. It was only the third such impeachment trial in American history. By now, more than 300 days had passed without a White House press briefing, a Washington ritual of accountability. It had fallen away so quietly that few seemed to notice this additional breach of normalcy. Then the worst pandemic in more than a century brought humanity to a standstill. The president dismissed it as a Chinese virus that would disappear like a miracle, called the growing uproar a hoax, disparaged those who disagreed or sought to forewarn him. Within weeks, the United States would be afflicted with the largest outbreak in the world, governors pleading for test kits and ventilators, nurses seen wrapping themselves in trash bags to shield against contagion as they aided the sick. The country was losing the capacity to be shocked. The unfathomable became just another part of one's day. What had happened to America? What could account for tens of millions of voters choosing to veer from all custom and to put the country and thus the world in the hands of an untested celebrity, one who had never served in either war or public office, unlike every man before him, and one whose rhetoric seemed a homing device for extremists? Were the coal miners and auto workers restless in a stagnating economy? Were the people in the heartland lashing back at the coastal elites? Was it that a portion of the electorate was just ready for a change? Was it really true that the woman in the race, the first to make it this close to the nation's highest office, had run an unholy mess of a campaign, as two veteran political journalists put it? Was it that urban, meaning black, voters did not turn out, and the evangelical, meaning white, voters did? How could so many people, ordinary working folks who needed health care and education for their children, protection of the water they drink and the wages they depended upon, vote against their own interests, as many progressives were heard to say in the fog of that turning point in political history? These were all popular theories in the aftermath, and there may have been some element of truth in a few of them. The earth had shifted overnight, or so it appeared. We have long defined earthquakes as arising from the collision of tectonic plates that force one wedge of earth beneath the other. Believed that the internal shoving match under the surface is all too easily recognizable. In classic earthquakes, we can feel the ground shudder and crack beneath us. We can see the devastation of the landscape or the tsunamis that follow. What scientists have only recently discovered is that the more familiar earthquakes, those that are easily measured while in progress and instantaneous in their destruction, are often preceded by longer, slow-moving, catastrophic disruptions, rumbling 20 miles or more beneath us, too deep to be felt and too quiet to be measured for most of human history. They are as potent as those we can see and feel, but they have long gone undetected because they work in silence, unrecognized until a major quake announces itself on the surface. Only recently have geophysicists had technology sensitive enough to detect the unseen stirrings deeper in the Earth's core. They are called silent earthquakes, and only recently have circumstances forced us, in this current era of human rupture, to search for the unseen stirrings of the human heart to discover the origins of our discontents. By the time of the American election that fateful year, back on the northernmost edge of the world, the Siberians were trying to recover from the heat that had stricken them months before. Dozens of the indigenous herding people had been relocated, some quarantined, and their tents disinfected. The authorities embarked on mass vaccinations of the surviving reindeer and their herders. They had gone for years without vaccinations because it had been decades since the last outbreak, and they felt the problem was in the past. An apparent mistake, a Russian biologist told a Russian news site. The military had to weigh how best to dispose of the 2,000 dead reindeer to keep the spores from spreading again. It was not safe merely to bury the carcasses to rid themselves of the pathogen. They would have to incinerate them in combustion fields of up to 500 degrees Celsius, then douse the cinders and surrounding land with bleach to kill the spores to protect the people going forward. Above all, and more vexing for humanity at large, was a sobering message of 2016 and the waning decade of a still new millennium, that rising heat in the Earth's oceans and in the human heart could revive long-buried threats, that some of the pathogens could never be killed, only contained, perhaps at best managed, with ever-improving vaccines against their expected mutations. What humanity learned, what one would hope, was that an ancient and hardy virus required perhaps more than anything knowledge of its ever-present danger, caution to protect against exposure, and alertness to the power of its longevity, its ability to mutate, survive, and hibernate until reawaken. It seemed these contagions could not be destroyed, not yet anyway, only managed and anticipated, as with any virus, and that foresight and vigilance, the wisdom of never taking them for granted, never underestimating their persistence, was perhaps the most effective antidote for now. The vitals of history. When we go to the doctor, he or she will begin to treat us without taking our history, and not just our history, but that of our parents and grandparents before. Let me go back. When we go to the doctor, he or she will not begin to treat us without taking our history, and not just our history, but that of our parents and grandparents before us. The doctor will not see us until we have filled out many pages on a clipboard that is handed to us upon arrival. The doctor will not hazard a diagnosis until he or she knows the history going back generations. As we fill out the pages of our medical past and our current complaints, what our bodies have been exposed to and what they have survived, it does us no good to pretend that certain ailments have not beset us, to deny the full truths of what brought us to this moment. Few problems have ever been solved by ignoring them. Looking beneath the history of one's country is like learning that alcoholism or depression runs in one's family, or that suicide has occurred more often than what might be usual, or with the advances in medical genetics, discovering that one has inherited the markers of BRCA mutation for breast cancer. You don't ball up in a corner with guilt or shame at these discoveries. You don't, if you're wise, forbid any mention of them. In fact, you do the opposite. You educate yourself, you talk to people who have been through it, and to specialists who have researched it. You learn the consequences and obstacles, the options, and the treatment. You may pray over it and meditate over it. Then you take precautions to protect yourself and succeeding generations, and work to ensure that these things, whatever they are, don't happen again. Chapter 2. An old house and an infrared light. The inspector trained his infrared lens into a misshapen bow in the ceiling, an invisible beam of light searching the layers of lath to test what the eye could not see. This house had been built generations ago, and I noticed the slightest welt in a corner of plaster in a spare bedroom had chalked it up to idiosyncrasy. Over time, the welt in the ceiling became a wave that widened and bulged despite the new roof. It had been building beyond perception for years. An old house and its own kind of devotional, a dowager aunt with a story to be coaxed out of her, a mystery, a series of interlocking puzzles awaiting solution. Why is this soffit tucked into the southwest corner of an eave? What's behind this discolored patch of brick? With an old house, the work is never done, and you don't expect it to be. America is an old house. We can never declare the work over. Wind, Flood, drought, and human upheavals batter a structure that is already fighting whatever flaws were left unattended in the original foundation. When you live in an old house, you may not want to go into the basement after a storm to see what the rains have wrought. Choose not to look, however, at your own peril. The owner of an old house knows that whatever you're ignoring will never go away. Whatever is lurking will fester whether you choose to look or not. Ignorance is no protection from the consequences of inaction. Whatever you're wishing away will gnaw at you until you gather the courage to face what you would rather not see. We in the developed world are like homeowners who inherited a house on a piece of land that's beautiful on the outside, but whose soil is unstable, loam and rock, heaving and contracting over generations, cracks patched, but the deeper ruptures waved away for decades, centuries even. Many people might rightly say, I had nothing to do with how this all started. I have nothing to do with the sins of the past. My ancestors never attacked indigenous people, never owned slaves. And yes, not one of us was here when this house was built. Our immediate ancestors may have had nothing to do with it, but here we are, the current occupants of a property with stress cracks and bowed walls and fissures built into the foundation. We are the heirs to whatever is right or wrong with it. We did not erect the uneven pillars or joists, but they are ours to deal with now. And any further deterioration is, in fact, on our hands. Unaddressed, the ruptures and diagonal cracks will not fix themselves. The toxins will not go away, but rather will spread, leach, and mutate as they already have. When people live in an old house, they come to adjust to the idiosyncrasies and outright dangers skulking in old structure. They put buckets under a wet ceiling, prop up groaning floors, learn to step over that rotting wood tread in the staircase. The awkward becomes acceptable, and the unacceptable becomes merely inconvenient. Live with it long enough, and the unthinkable becomes normal. Exposed over the generations, we learn to believe that the incomprehensible is the way that life is supposed to be. The inspector was facing the mystery of the misshapen ceiling, and so he first held the sensor to the surface to detect if it was damp. The reading inconclusive, he then pulled out the infrared camera to take a kind of x-ray of whatever was going on, the idea being that you cannot fix a problem until and unless you can see it. He could now see past the plaster, beyond what had been wallpapered or painted over, as we now are called upon to do in the house we all live in, to examine a structure built long ago. Excuse me a moment. Like other old houses, America has an unseen skeleton, a caste system that is essential to its operation, as are the studs and joists that we cannot see in the physical buildings we call home. Caste is the infrastructure of our divisions. It's the architecture of human hierarchy, the subconscious code of instructions for maintaining, in our case, a 400-year-old social order. Looking at caste is like holding the country's x-ray up to the light. A caste system is an artificial construction, a fixed and embedded ranking of human value that sets the presumed supremacy of one group against the presumed inferiority of other groups on the basis of ancestry and often immutable traits that would be neutral in the abstract but are ascribed life and death meaning in a hierarchy favoring the dominant caste whose forebears designed it. A caste system uses rigid, often arbitrary boundaries to keep the ranked groupings apart, distinct from one another and in their assigned places. Throughout human history, 3 caste systems have stood out. The tragically accelerated, chilling, and officially vanquished caste system of Nazi Germany, the lingering millennia-long caste system of India, and the shape-shifting, unspoken, race-based caste pyramid in the United States. Each version relied on stigmatizing those deemed inferior to justify the dehumanization necessary to keep the lowest-ranked people at the bottom and to rationalize the protocols of enforcement. A caste system endures because it's often justified as divine will, originating from sacred text, or the presumed laws of nature reinforced throughout the culture and passed down through the generations. As we go about our daily lives, caste is the wordless usher in a darkened theater, flashlight cast down in the aisle, guiding us to our assigned seats for a performance. The hierarchy of caste is not about feelings or morality. It's about power. Which groups have it and which do not. It's about resources. Which caste is seen as worthy of them and which are not. And who gets to acquire and control them and who does not. It's about respect, authority, and assumptions of competence. Who is accorded these and who is not. As a means of assigning value to entire swaths of humankind, caste guides each of us often beyond the reaches of our awareness. It embeds into our bones an unconscious ranking of human characteristics and sets forth the rules, expectations, and stereotypes that have been used to justify brutalities against entire groups within our species. In the American caste system, the signal of rank is what we call race, the division of humans on the basis of their appearance. In America, race is the primary tool and the visible decoy, the front man, for caste. Race does a heavy lifting for a caste system that demands a means of human division. If we have been trained to see humans in the language of race, then caste is the underlying grammar that we encode as children, as when learning our mother tongue. Caste, like grammar, becomes an invisible guide not only to how we speak, but how we process information, the autonomous calculations that we figure into a sentence without having to think about it. Many of us have never taken a class in grammar, yet we know in our bones that a transitive verb takes an object. That a subject needs a predicate, we know without thinking the difference between third-person singular and third-person plural. We may mention race, referring to people as black or white or Latino or Asian or indigenous. What lies beneath each label is centuries of history and assigning of assumptions and values to physical features and a structure of human hierarchy. What people look like, or rather the race they have been assigned or are perceived to belong to, is the visible cue to their caste. It's a historic flashcard to the public of how they are to be treated, where they are expected to live, what kinds of positions they are expected to hold, whether they belong in this section of town or that seat in a boardroom, whether they should be expected to speak with authority on this subject or that, whether they will be administered pain relief in a hospital, whether their neighborhood is likely to join a toxic waste site or have contaminated water flowing from their taps, whether they are more or less likely to survive childbirth in the most advanced nation in the world, whether they may be shot by authorities with impunity. We know that the letters of the alphabet are neutral and meaningless until they are combined to make a word which itself has no significance until it is inserted into a sentence and interpreted by those who speak it. In the same way that black and white were applied to the people who were literally neither, but rather gradations of brown and beige and ivory, the caste system sets people at poles from one another and attaches meaning to the extremes and to the gradations in between, and then reinforces those meanings, replicates them in the roles each caste was and is assigned and permitted or required to perform. Caste and race are neither synonymous nor mutually exclusive. They can and do exist in the same culture and serve to reinforce each other. Race, in the United States, is the visible agent of the unseen force of caste. Caste is the bones, race the skin. Race is what we can see, the physical traits that have been given arbitrary meaning and become shorthand for who a person is. Caste is the powerful infrastructure that holds each group in its place. Caste is fixed and rigid. Race is fluid and superficial, subject to periodic redefinition to meet the needs of the dominant caste in what is now the United States. While the requirements to qualify as white have changed over the centuries, the fact of a dominant caste has remained constant from its inception. Whoever fit the definition of white, at whatever point in history, was granted the legal rights and privileges of the dominant caste. Perhaps more critically and tragically, at the other end of the ladder, the subordinated caste, too, has been fixed from the beginning of the psychological floor beneath which all other castes cannot fall. Thus we are all born into a silent war game, centuries old, co-listed in teams not of our own choosing. The side to which we are now assigned in the American system of categorizing people is proclaimed by the team uniform that each caste wears, signaling our presumed worth and potential. That any of us manages to create abiding connections across these manufactured divisions is a testament to the beauty of the human spirit. The use of inherited physical characteristics to differentiate inner abilities and group value may be the cleverest way that a culture has ever devised to manage and maintain a caste system. As a social and human division, wrote the political scientist Andrew Hacker of the use of physical traits to form human categories, it surpasses all others, even gender, in intensity and subordination. Chapter 3. An American Untouchable. In the winter of 1959, after leading the Montgomery bus boycott that arose from the arrest of Rosa Parks and before the trials and triumphs to come, Martin Luther King Jr. and his wife Coretta landed in India, in the city then known as Bombay, to visit the land of Mohandas Gandhi, the father of the nonviolent protest. They were covered in garlands upon arrival, and King told reporters, "To other countries I may go as a tourist, but to India I come as a pilgrim." He had long dreamed of going to India, and they stayed on an entire month at the invitation of Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru. King wanted to see for himself the place whose fight for freedom from British rule had inspired his fight for justice in America. He wanted to see the so-called untouchables, the lowest caste in the ancient Indian caste system, whom he had read of and had sympathy for, but who had still been left behind after India gained its independence the decade before. He discovered that people in India, who had been following the trials of his own oppressed people in America, knew of the bus boycotts he had led. Wherever he went, the people on the streets of Bombay and Delhi crowded around him for an autograph. One afternoon, King and his wife journeyed to the southern tip of the country, to the city of Trivandrum in the state of Kerala, and visited with high school students whose families had been untouchables. The principal made the introduction. "Young people," he said, "I would like to present to you a fellow untouchable from the United States of America." King was floored. He had not expected that term to be applied to him. He was, in fact, put off by it at first. He had flown in from another continent, had dined with the Prime Minister. He did not see the connection, did not see what the Indian caste system had to do directly with him, did not immediately see why the lowest caste people in India would view him, an American Negro and a distinguished visitor, as low caste like themselves, see him as one of them. "For a moment," he wrote, "I was a bit shocked and peeved that I would be referred to as an untouchable." Then he began to think about the reality of the lives of the people he was fighting for. 20 million people consigned to the lowest rank in America for centuries, still smoldering in an airtight cage of poverty, quarantined in isolated ghettos, exiled in their own country. And he said to himself, "Yes, I'm an untouchable, and every Negro in the United States of America is an untouchable." In that moment he realized that the land of the free had imposed a caste system not unlike the caste system of India, and that he had lived under that system all his life. It was what lay beneath the forces he was fighting in America. What Martin Luther King Jr. recognized about this country that day had begun long before the ancestors of our ancestors had taken their first breaths. More than a century and a half before the American Revolution, a human hierarchy had evolved on the contested soil of what would become the United States, a concept of birthright, the temptation of entitled expansion that would set in motion the world's first democracy, and with it, a ranking of human value and usage. It would twist the minds of men as greed and self-reverence eclipsed human conscience to take land and human bodies that the conquering men convinced themselves they had a right to. If they were to convert this wilderness and civilize it to their liking, they decided they would need to conquer, enslave, or remove the people already on it, and transport those they deemed lesser beings to tame and work the land to extract the wealth that lay in the rich soil and shorelines. To justify their plans, they took pre-existing notions of their own centrality, reinforced by their self-interested interpretation of the Bible, and created a hierarchy of who could do what, who could own what, who was on top, and who was on the bottom, and who was in between. There emerged a ladder of humanity, global in nature, as the upper-rung people would descend from Europe with rungs inside their designation. The English Protestants, at the very top of their guns and resources, would ultimately prevail in the bloody fight over North America. Everyone else would rank in descending order on the basis of their proximity to those deemed most superior. The ranking would continue downward until one arrived at the very bottom. African captives transported to build the New World and to serve the victors for all their days, one generation after the next for 12 generations. They developed a caste system based upon what people looked like, an internalized ranking, unspoken, unnamed, unacknowledged by everyday citizens even as they go about their lives, adhering to it and acting upon it, subconsciously to this day, just as the studs and joists and beams that form the infrastructure of a building are not visible to those who live in it, so it is with the caste. Its very invisibility is what gives it power and longevity, and though it may move in and out of consciousness, though it may flare and reassert itself in times of upheaval and recede in times of relative calm, it is the ever-present through line in the country's operation. Excuse me. Caste is not a term often applied to the United States. It's considered the language of India or feudal Europe. Excuse me. But some anthropologists and scholars of race in America have made use of the term for decades. Before the modern era, one of the earliest Americans to take up the idea of caste was antebellum abolitionist and U.S. Senator Charles Sumner, as he fought against segregation in the North. The separation of children in the public schools of Boston, on account of color or race, he wrote, is in the nature of caste, and on this account is a violation of equality. He quoted a fellow humanitarian, "Caste makes distinctions where God has made none." We cannot fully understand the current upheavals or most any turning point in American history without accounting for the human pyramid encrypted into us all. The caste system and the attempts to defend, uphold, or abolish the hierarchy underlay the American Civil War and the Civil Rights Movement a century later, and pervade the politics of 21st century America. Just as DNA is the code of instructions for cell development, caste is the operating system for economic, political, and social interaction in the United States from the time of its gestation. In 1944, the Swedish social economist Gunnar Myrdal and team of the most talented researchers in the country produce a 2,800-page, two-volume work that is still considered perhaps the most comprehensive study of race in America, An American Dilemma. Meridell's investigation into race led him to the realization that the most accurate term to describe the workings of American society was not race, but caste. That perhaps it was the only term that addresses what seemed a stubbornly fixed ranking of human value. He came to the conclusion that America had created a caste system and that the effort to maintain the color line has, to the ordinary white man, the function of upholding that caste system itself, of keeping the Negro in his place. The anthropologist Ashley Montagu was among the first to argue that race is a human intervention, a social construct, not a biological one, and that in seeking to understand the divisions and disparities in the United States, we have typically fallen into the quicksand and mythology of race. When we speak of the race problem in America, he wrote in 1942, what we really mean is the caste system and the problems in which that caste system creates in America. There was little confusion among some of the leading white supremacists of the previous century as to the connections between India's caste system and that of the American South, where the purest legal caste system existed in the United States. A record of the desperate efforts of the conquering upper classes in India to preserve the purity of their blood persists until this very day in their carefully regulated system of castes, wrote Madison Grant, a popular eugenicist, in his 1916 bestseller, The Passing of the Great Race. In our southern states, Jim Crow, cars, and social discriminations have exactly the same purpose. Excuse me. A caste system has a way of filtering down to every inhabitant, its codes absorbed like mineral springs, settling the expectations where one fits on the ladder. The mill worker, with nobody else to look down upon, regards himself as eminently superior to the Negro, observed the Yale scholar Liston Pope in 1942. The colored man represents his last outpost against social oblivion. It was in 1913 that a prominent Southern educator, Thomas Pierce Bailey, took it upon himself to assemble what he called the racial creed of the South. It amounted to the central tenets of the caste system. One of the tenets was, let the lowest white man count for more than the highest Negro. That same year, a man born to the bottom of India's caste system, born and untouchable in the central provinces, arrived in New York City from Bombay. That fall, Bhimrao Ambedkar came to the United States to study economics as a graduate student at Columbia, focused on the differences between race, caste, and class. Living just blocks from Harlem, he would see firsthand the condition of his counterparts in America. He completed his thesis just as the film Birth of a Nation, the incendiary homage to the Confederate South, premiered in New York City in 1915. He would study further in London and return to India to become the foremost leader of the Untouchables and a preeminent intellectual who would help draft a new Indian constitution. He would work to dispense with the demeaning term untouchable. He rejected the term Harijans applied to them by Gandhi, patronizingly so to their minds. He spoke of his people as Dalits, meaning broken people, which due to the caste system they were. It's hard to know what effect his exposure to the social order in America had on him personally, but over the years he paid close attention, as did the Dalits, to the subordinate caste in America. Indians had long been aware of the plight of enslaved Africans and of their descendants in the pre-Civil War United States. Back in the 1870s, after the end of slavery and during the brief window of black advancement known as Reconstruction, an Indian social reformer named Jyotiba found inspiration in abolitionists. He expressed hope that my countrymen may take their noble example as their guide. Many decades later, in the summer of 1946, acting on news that black Americans were petitioning the United Nations for protection as minorities, Ambedkar reached out to the best-known African-American intellectual of the day, W.E.B. Du Bois. He told Du Bois that he had been a student of the Negro problem from across the oceans and recognized their common fates. There is so much similarity between the position of the untouchables in India and of the position of Negroes in America, Ambedkar wrote to Du Bois, that the study of the latter is not only natural, but necessary. Du Bois wrote back to Ambedkar to say that he was indeed familiar with him and that he had every sympathy with the untouchables of India. It had been Du Bois who seemed to have spoken for the marginalized in both countries as he identified the double consciousness of their existence. And it was Du Bois who decades before had invoked an Indian concept in channeling the bitter cry of his people in America. Why did God make me an outcast and a stranger in mine own house? I embarked upon this book with a similar desire to reach out across the oceans to better understand how all this began in the United States, the assigning of meaning to unchangeable physical characteristics. The pyramid passed down through the centuries that defines and directs politics and policies and personal interactions. What are the origins and workings of the hierarchy that intrudes upon the daily life and life chances of every American? That had intruded upon my own life with disturbing regularity and consequences. I began investigating the American caste system after nearly 2 decades of examining the history of the Jim Crow South, the legal caste system that grew out of enslavement and lasted into the early 1970s, within the lifespans of many current-day Americans. I discovered, while working on the warmth of their suns, that I was not writing about geography and relocation, but about the American caste system, an artificial hierarchy in which most everything that you could and could not do was based upon what you looked like, and that manifested itself north and south. I had been writing about a stigmatized people, 6 million of them, who were seeking freedom from the caste system in the South, only to discover that the hierarchy followed them wherever they went, much in the way that the shadow of caste, I would soon discover, followed Indians in their own global diaspora. For this book, I wanted to understand the origins and evolution of classifying and elevating one group of people over another, and the consequences of doing so to the presumed beneficiaries and to those targeted as beneath them. Moving about the world as a living, breathing caste experiment myself, I wanted to understand the hierarchies that I and many millions of others who have had to navigate to pursue our work and dreams. To do so meant, for one, looking into the world's most recognized caste system, India's, and examining the parallels, overlaps, and contrasts between the one that prevailed in my own country and the original. I also sought to comprehend the molecular, concentrated evil that had produced the only caste system imposed in Nazi Germany, and found startling, unsettling connections between the United States and Germany in the decades leading to the Third Reich. Searching the histories of all 3 hierarchies and poring over a wealth of studies on caste across many disciplines, I began to compile the parallels in a more systematic way, and identified the essential shared characteristics of those hierarchies, what I called the 8 pillars of caste, traits disturbingly present in all of them. Scholars have devoted tremendous energy to studying the Jim Crow caste system under whose shadow the United States still labors, while others have intensely studied the millennia-old caste system of India. Scholars have tended to regard them in isolation, specializing in one or the other. Few Few have held them side by side, and those who have done so have often been met with resistance. Undeterred by what for me became a mission, I sought to dig up the taproots of hierarchy and the distortions and injustice it yields. Beyond the United States, my research took me to London, Berlin, Delhi, and Edinburgh, followed the historic threads of inherited human rank. To further document this phenomenon, I chose to describe scenes of caste throughout this work, some drawn reluctantly from my own encounters with caste, and others told to me by the people who experienced them or who had intimate knowledge of them. While this book seeks to consider the effects on everyone caught in the hierarchy, it devotes significant attention to the poles of the American caste system, those at the top, European Americans, who have been its primary beneficiaries, and those at the bottom, African Americans, against whom the caste system has directed its full powers of dehumanization. The American caste system began in the years after the arrival of the first Africans to Virginia colony in the summer of 1619, as the colony sought to refine the distinctions of who could be enslaved for life and who could not. Over time, the colonial laws granted English and Irish indentured servants greater privileges than the Africans who worked alongside them, and the Europeans were fused into a new identity, that of being categorized as white, the polar opposite of black. The historian Kenneth W. Stamp called this assigning of race a caste system, which divided those whose appearance enabled them to claim pure Caucasian ancestry from those whose appearance indicated that some or all of their forebears were Negroes. Members of the Caucasian caste, as he called it, believed in white supremacy and maintained a high degree of caste solidarity to secure it. Thus, throughout this book, you will see many references to the American South, the birthplace of this caste system. The South is where the majority of the subordinate caste was consigned to live for most of the country's history, and for that reason is where the caste system was formalized and most brutally enforced. It was there that the tenets of intercaste relations first took hold before spreading to the rest of the country, leading the writer Alexis de Tocqueville to observe in 1831, "The prejudice of race appears to be stronger in the states that have abolished slavery than in those where it still exists, and nowhere is it so tolerant as in those states where servitude has never been known." Is it so intolerant as to those states where servitude has never been known? To recalibrate how we see ourselves, I use language that may be more commonly associated with people in other cultures to suggest a new way of understanding our hierarchy. Dominant caste, ruling majority, favored caste or upper caste, instead of or in addition to white. Middle castes, instead of or in addition to Asian or Latino. Subordinate caste, lowest caste, bottom caste, disfavored caste, historically stigmatized instead of African American. Original, conquered, or indigenous peoples instead of or in addition to Native American. Marginalized people in addition to or instead of women of any race or minorities of any kind. Some of this may sound like a foreign language. In other ways, some of this may sound like a foreign language. In some ways it is, and it's meant to be. Because to truly understand America, we must open our eyes to the hidden work of a caste system that has gone unnamed but prevails among us to our collective detriment, to see that we have more in common with each other and with cultures than we might otherwise dismiss, and to summon the courage to consider that therein may lie the answers. Excuse me. In embarking upon this work, I devoured books about caste in India and in the United States. Anything with the word caste in it lit up my neurons. I discovered kindred spirits from the past, sociologists, anthropologists, ethnographers, writers whose work carried me through time and across generations. Many had labored against the tide, and I felt that I was carrying on a tradition and was not walking alone. In the midst of the research, word of my inquiries spread to some Indian scholars of caste based here in America. They invited me to speak at an inaugural conference on caste and race at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst, the town where W.E.B. Du Bois' papers are kept. There I told the audience that I had written a 600-page book about the Jim Crow era in the American South, the time of naked white supremacy, but that the word racism did not appear anywhere in the narrative. I told them that after spending 15 years studying the topic and hearing the testimony of the survivors of the era, I realized that the term was insufficient. Caste was the more accurate term, and I set out to them the reasons why. They were both stunned and heartened. The plates of Indian food kindly set before me at the reception thereafter sat cold due to the press of questions and the sharing that went into the night. At a closing ceremony that I had not been made aware of ahead of time, the host presented me a bronze-colored bust of the patron saint of the low-born of India, Bhimrao Ambedkar, the Dalit leader who had written to Du Bois all those decades before. It felt like an initiation into a caste to which I had somehow always belonged. Over and over they shared scenarios of what they had endured, and I responded in personal recognition, as if even to anticipate some particular turn or outcome. To their astonishment, I began to be able to tell who was highborn and who was lowborn among the Indian people among us, not from what they looked like, as one might in the United States, but on the basis of the universal human response to hierarchy. In the case of an upper caste person, an inescapable certitude in bearing, demeanor, behavior, a visible expectation of centrality. After one session, I went up to a woman presenter whose caste I had ascertained from observing her interactions. I noticed that she had reflexively stood over the Dalit speaker and had taken it upon herself to explain what the Dalit woman had just said, or meant to take a position of authority, as if by second nature, perhaps without realizing it. We chatted a bit, and then I said to her, "I believe you must be upper caste, are you not?" She looked crestfallen. "How did you know?" she said. "I try so hard." We talked for what seemed an hour or more, and I could see the effort it took to manage the unconscious signals of encoded superiority, the presence of mind necessary to counteract the programming of caste. I could see how hard it was, even for someone committed to healing the caste divide, who was, as it turned out, married to a man from the subordinate caste and who was deeply invested in egalitarian ideals. On the way home, I was snapped back to my own world when airport security flagged my suitcase for inspection. The TSA worker happened to be an African-American who looked to be in his early 20s. He strapped on latex gloves and began his work. He dug through my suitcase and excavated a small box, unwrapped the folds of paper, and held in his palm the bust of Ambedkar that I had been given. "This is what came up in the X-ray," he said. It was heavy like a paperweight. He turned it upside down and inspected it from all sides, his gaze lingering at the bottom of it. He seemed concerned that something might be inside. "I'll have to swipe it," he warned me. He came back after some time and declared it was okay. I could continue with it on my journey. He looked at the bespectacled face with the receding hairline and steadfast expression, and seemed to wonder why I would be carrying what looked like a totem from another culture. "So who is this?" he asked. The name Ambedkar alone would not have registered. I had learned of him myself only the year before, and there was no time to explain the parallel caste system, so I blurted out what seemed to make the most sense. "Oh," I said, "this is the Martin Luther King of India." "Pretty cool," he said, satisfied now, and seemed a little proud. He then wrapped Ambedkar back up as if he were king himself and sent him back gently in the suitcase. An inevitable program. In the imagination of two late 20th century filmmakers, an unseen force of artificial intelligence had overtaken the human species, had managed to control humans in all alternate reality in which everything one sees, feels, hears, tastes, smells, touches is in actuality a program. There are programs within programs, and humans become not just programmed, but are in danger of, and in fact, well on their way to becoming nothing more than programs. What is reality and what is program morph into one? The interlocking programs pass for life itself. The great quest in the film series The Matrix involves those humans who awaken to this realization as they search for a way to escape their entrapment. Those who accept their programming get to lead in deadened surface lives enslaved. Those who accept their programming get to lead deadened surface lives enslaved to a semblance of reality. They are captives, safe on the surface, as long as they are unaware of their captivity. Perhaps it is the unthinking acquiescence, the blindness to one's imprisonment, that is the most effective way for human beings to remain captive. People who do not know that they are captive will not resist their bondage. But those who are awakened to their captivity threaten the hum of the matrix. Any attempt to escape their imprisonment risks detection, signals a breach in the order, exposes the artifice of reality that has been imposed upon human beings. The matrix, the unseen master program fed by the survival instinct of an automated collective, does not react well to threats to its existence. In a crucial moment, a man who is only recently awakened to the program in which he and his species are ensnared consults a wise woman, the oracle, who it appears would guide him. He is uncertain and wary as he takes a seat next to her on a park bench that may or may not be real. She speaks in code and metaphor. A flock of birds alights on the pavement beyond them. "See those birds?" the oracle says to him. At some point, a program was written to govern them. She looks up and scans the horizon. A program was written to watch over the trees and the wind, the sunrise and the sunset. There are programs running all over the place. Some of these programs go without notice, so perfectly attuned they are to their tasks, so deeply embedded in the drome of existence. The ones doing their job, she tells him, doing what they were meant to do, are invisible. You'd never even know they're here. So too with the caste system as it goes about its work in silence. The string of puppet master unseen by those whose subconscious it directs, its instructions on intravenous drip to the mind, cast in the guise of normalcy, injustice looking just, atrocities looking unavoidable to keep the machinery humming. The matrix of caste as a facsimile for life itself, and whose purpose is maintaining the primacy of those hoarding and holding tight to power. Okay, let's see. Who's around? Well, guess I'm going to be here for a little bit longer. Okay, part 2, the arbitrary construction of human divisions. Chapter 4, a long-running play in the emergence of caste in America. Day after day, the curtain rises on a stage of epic proportions, one that has been running for centuries. The actors wear the costumes of their predecessors and inhabit the roles assigned to them. The people in those roles are not the characters they play, but they have played the roles long enough to incorporate the roles into their very being, to merge the assignment to their inner selves and how they are seen in the world. The costumes were handed out at birth and can never be removed. The costumes cue everyone in the cast to the roles of each character. The costumes cue everyone in the cast to the roles each character is to play, and to each character's place on the stage. Over the run of this show, the cast has grown accustomed to who plays which part. For generations, everyone has known who is center stage in the lead. Everyone knows who the hero is, who the supporting characters are, who's the sidekick good for laughs, and who is in the shadow, the undifferentiated chorus with no lines to speak, no voice to sing, but necessary for the production to work. The roles become sufficiently embedded into the identity of the players. The roles become sufficiently embedded into the identity of the players that the leading man or woman would not be expected so much as to know the names of or take notice of the people in the back, and there would be no need for them to do so. Stay in the roles long enough, and everyone begins to believe that the roles are preordained, that each cast member is best suited by talent and temperament for their assigned role, and that maybe for only that role. That they belong there and were meant to be cast as they are currently seen. The cast members become associated with their characters, typecast, locked into either inflated or disfavored assumptions. They become their characters. As an actor, you are to move the way you are directed to move, speak the way your character is expected to speak. You are not yourself. You are not to be yourself. Stick to the script and to the part you are cast to play, and you'll be rewarded. Veer from the script, and you will face the consequences. Veer from the script, and other cast members will step in to remind you that you went off script. Do it often enough, or at a critical moment, and you may be fired, demoted, cast out, your character conveniently killed off in the plot. The social pyramid known as a caste system is not identified to the cast in a play, though the similarity in the two words hint at a tantalizing intersection. When we are cast into roles, we're not ourselves. We are not supposed to be ourselves. We are performing based on our place in the production, not necessarily on who we are inside. We are all players on a stage that was built long before our ancestors arrived in this land. We are the latest cast in a long-running drama that premiered on this soil in the early 17th century. It was late August 1619, a year before the Pilgrims landed at Plymouth Rock, that a Dutch man-of-war set anchor at the mouth of the James River at Point Comfort in the wilderness of what is now known as Virginia. We know this only because of the haphazard line in a letter written by an early settler, John Rolfe. This is the oldest surviving reference to Africans in the English colonies in America, people who look different from the colonists and who would ultimately be assigned by law to the bottom of an emerging caste system. Ralph mentions them as merchandise, and not necessarily the merchandise the English settlers had been expecting. The ship brought not anything but 20 and odd Negroes, Ralph wrote, which the governor and Cape merchant bought for victuals. These Africans had been captured from a slave ship bound for the Spanish colonies, but were sold farther north to the British. Historians do not agree on what their status was, if they were bound on the short term for indentured servitude, or relegated immediately to the status of lifetime enslavement, the condition that would befall most every human who looked like them arriving on these shores or born here for the next quarter millennium. The few surviving records from the time of their arrival show they held at the outset a singularly debased status in the eyes of white Virginians, wrote the historian Alden T. Vaughan. If not yet consigned formally to permanent enslavement, black Virginians were at least well on their way to such a condition. In the decades to follow, colonial laws herded European workers and African workers into separate and unequal queues and set in motion the caste system that would become the cornerstone of the social, political, and economic system in America. This caste system would trigger the deadliest war on U.S. soil, lead to the ritual killings of thousands of subordinate caste people and lynchings, and become the source of inequalities that becloud and destabilize the country to this day. With the first rough attacks at a colonial census conducted in Virginia in 1630, a hierarchy began to form. Few Africans were seen as significant enough to be listed in the census by name, as would be the case for the generations to follow, in contrast to the majority of European inhabitants, indentured or not. The Africans were not cited by age or arrival date as were Europeans, information vital to setting the terms and time frame of indenture for Europeans, or for Africans, had they been in the same category, been seen as equal, or seen as needing to be accurately accounted for. Thus, before there was a United States of America, there was the caste system, born in colonial Virginia. At first, religion, not race as we know it, defines the status of people in the colonies. Christianity, as a proxy for Europeans, generally exempted European workers from lifetime enslavement. This initial distinction is what condemned first indigenous people and then Africans, most of whom were not Christian upon arrival, to the lowest rung of an emerging hierarchy before the concept of race had congealed to justify their eventual and total debasement. The creation of a caste system was a process of testing the bounds of human categories and not the result of a single edict. It was a decades-long sharpening of lines whenever the colonists had a decision to make. When Africans began converting to Christianity, they posed a challenge to a religion-based hierarchy. Their efforts to claim full participation in the colonies was in direct opposition to the European hunger for the cheapest, most pliant labor to extract the most wealth from the New World. The strengths of African workers became their undoing. British colonists in the West Indies, for example, saw Africans as a civilized and relatively docile population who were accustomed to discipline and who cooperated well on a given task. Almost makes them sound like dogs. Africans demonstrated an immunity to European diseases, making them more viable to the colonists than were the indigenous people the Europeans had originally tried to enslave. More pressingly, the colonies of the Chesapeake were faltering and needed manpower to cultivate tobacco. The colonies farther south were suited for sugarcane, rice, and cotton, crops which the English had little experience, but the Africans had further cultivated in their native lands or were quick to master. The colonists soon realized that without Africans and the skills that they brought, their enterprises would fail, wrote the anthropologists Audrey and Brian Smedley. In the eyes of the European colonists, and to the Africans' tragic disadvantage, they happened to bear an inadvertent birthmark over their entire bodies that should have been nothing more than a neutral variation in human appearance, but which made them stand out from the English and Irish indentured servants. The Europeans could and did escape from their masters and blend into the general white population that was hardening into a single caste. The Gaelic insurrections caused the English to seek to replace the source of servile labor entirely with another source, African slaves, the Smedleys wrote. The colonists had been unable to enslave the native population on its own turf and believed themselves to have solved the labor problem with the Africans they imported. With little further use for the original inhabitants, the colonists began to exile them from their ancestral lands and from the emerging caste system. This left Africans firmly at the bottom, and by the late 1600s, Africans were not merely slaves, they were hostages subjected to unspeakable tortures that their captors documented without remorse. And there was no one on the planet willing to pay a ransom for their rescue. Americans are loath to talk about enslavement in part because what little we know about what goes against our perception of our country as just an enlightened nation, a beacon of democracy for the world. Slavery is commonly dismissed as a sad, dark chapter in the country's history. It is as if the greater distance we can create between slavery and ourselves, the better to stave off the guilt or shame it induces. But in the same way that individuals cannot move forward, become whole and healthy unless they examine the domestic violence they witness as children or the alcoholism that runs in their family, the country cannot become whole until it confronts what was not a chapter in its history, but the basis of its economic and social order. For a quarter millennium, slavery was the country. Slavery was a part of everyday life, a spectacle that public officials and European visitors to the slaving provinces could not help but comment on with curiosity and revulsion. In a speech in the House of Representatives, a 19th century congressman from Ohio lamented that on the beautiful avenue in front of the Capitol, members of Congress during this session have been compelled to turn aside from their paths to permit a coffle of slaves, males and females, chained to each other by their necks, to pass on their way to this national slave market. The Secretary of the U.S. Navy expressed horror at the sight of barefoot men and women locked together with the weight of an ox chain in the beating sun, forced to walk the distance to damnation in a state further south, and riding between them a white man on horseback carrying pistols in his belt, and who, as we passed him, had the impudence to look us in the face without blushing. The Navy official James K. Paulding said, "When they, the slaveholders, permit such flagrant and indecent outrages upon humanity as I have described, when they sanction a villain in thus marching half-naked men and women loaded with chains, without being charged with a crime but that of being black, from one section of the United States to another, hundreds of miles in the face of the day, they disgrace themselves and the country to which they belong." Terry,
Yeah.
you want to go ahead and read?
That's it?
You want to take over?
Okay.
You need to do something?
Well, yeah. I'm gonna.
Okay.